After many years, structure is something which I have learnt is important in any medium, whether it is in the writings of a novel, an article, a history dissertation, or a television show. Before we go any further, make sure you hit that bell and subscribe. Did you see what I did there? Did you see how out of place that little instruction may have seemed just then? Well, this is a point which will resurface later in this video. For the time being, let's talk about how the structure of the way stories have been produced for Doctor Who have evolved so much since the show's inception in 1963. Disclaimer to all my viewers. I have no extensive knowledge of how TV shows have been produced throughout the times Doctor Who has been on air. Indeed, I do have some knowledge after undertaking some research for preparation for this very video, and I've watched the odd episode or two of Doctor Who. I don't know if you can tell. To have the full insight, I suppose I would have needed to be present behind the scenes to get a full understanding of how things transpired, whether it be through the writing process, production, or even from the director's chair. I'm not even going to suggest for 1 second that my stance on the way the show has been structured throughout the ages is even correct. Consider this, that what I say in this video is not facts. It's purely opinion. Okay. Are you sitting comfortably? Good. Then we shall begin. In 1963, no one knew how much of a phenomenon Doctor Who would become. I mean, hey, we're here talking about it nearly 60 years later. That tells you something. Initially, the programme was meant to run for 13 weekly half-hour episodes. That is roughly half the length of the series today, or a bit shorter than seasons 23 to 26. Due to the popularity of a certain monster that appeared during the second serial, oh, I wonder what that could be. The original run of 13 episodes was extended to 42. Wow. For one season of a TV show, that is one hell of a feat, especially in today's standards. Obviously, there weren't 42 stories in all of season 1, because that would just be ridiculous. There were no story to tell. Instead, each story had a serialised format, something which became a mainstay for the show until it was cancelled in 1989. Each serial had variable time spans. For example, the first story, An Unearthly Child, lasted for 4 episodes. That's 4 weeks in total. The second story, The Daleks, lasted for 7 episodes. The third story, The Edge of Destruction, lasted for 2, and so on. The story's length depended on how much the production cost for it, which goes in line with how much ambition the writers had. The most ambitious story from the first 3 must have been The Daleks. It was set in the future, it had a huge cast of characters including the Thals, and you had blokes inside operating the Dalek props. It had impressive sets which were built for the corridors of the Dalek city, and it added a lot of scope to this tale. It makes sense that the production were willing to make the most out of everything which was created for this very story, and for as long as they did it, they couldn't do anything else. Forgive my rambling here, but in modern Doctor Who, a 7-part story sounds so ludicrous, and I'll admit that watching this back does seem to be a slog. And That's the same case for many other 7-parters, or 6-parters, or even 4-parters from the classic era. However, if you look past all of that, what you have here is a really solid piece of television. This laid the groundwork for what would become an institution in TV history. As a story, The Daleks was a story which was probably the most important until the 10th Planet a couple of years later. Not only did it ensure that Doctor Who would run past that initial demand of 13 episodes, but it also introduced the definitive Doctor Who monster. After the show continued its first season beyond its initial 13 episode run, in my eyes, the production did go from strength to strength to a certain extent. Newman and Lambert's visions of having the show become educational to younger audiences were fully realised with historical stories such as Marco Polo, the Aztecs, and the Reign of Terror, just to name a few. In my view, most of the historical stories from the William Hartnell era are some of the standout ones in the entire franchise, and his era should be checked out for those alone. What would tend to happen from this season until more or less the end of the Hartnell era would be one story was set in the future, the next would be in the past, rinse and repeat. We hardly had any adventures which took place in the present day, which, in hindsight, is refreshing. Each episode, the Doctor and his friends, and you, the viewers, charted unfamiliar territory. Of course, this will be flipped on its head successfully in later seasons with Hartnell's successors. I think, despite the shortcomings of some of the outings of the early years, with overly long ones like the Web Planet, which is just too ambitious for its own good, or just a couple of other bits and pieces in the general from the Hartnell era, there was a clear structure which I think was translated well from script to screen for the most part.
Yes, I know not everything went to plan, as sometimes the actors might have fallen ill or were on holiday sometimes. With some budget limitations, I honestly think that the cast and crew pulled off a few miracles, because the production time was mental. I think on occasions the casts were recorded doing the scenes and the episode could be out within days. I am not joking. There was hardly any time to rehearse due to the harsh production. Therefore, we saw fluff lines stay in the final product. When you watch these stories back, keep in mind that the writers, the crew, and most of all, the cast were under immense pressure to get their work done in such a short space of time. My main criticism for the way that the show was structured in this time was simply because a few of the stories were too damn long. I mentioned earlier about having stories like the Daleks and the Web Planet for being too long. When you have a particular story which you find a bit boring, it will end up being a chore to get through. Very often there are some stories in this era and even in later eras which have a strong opening episode. However, when you have a story to tell across 4 weeks or 7 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 10 weeks, whatever the episode count is, you have a lot of things to do, and sometimes it doesn't work, but sometimes it does. And when it does, you are going to have a good time. Eventually, when the show became almost unbearable for William Hartnell to continue, we got Troughton, a much younger and energetic character compared to Hartnell's grandfatherly figure. As alluded to earlier, the 10th Planet was also one of the most important stories in Doctor Who because it introduced the concept of regeneration. This story began a trend in structure itself because from here on out, every few years when the main actor left the show, their Doctor regenerated and a new actor would take over from them, therefore starting a new era, bringing new ideas to the table, thus potentially changing the whole balance of structure which had been established before. This was the biggest shake-up in Doctor Who history, at least until we ended up with our first female Doctor. At least here, the story format seemed to be relatively similar. The Troughton era begins on familiar ground with the power of the Daleks. The Daleks must have been used here for Troughton's debut to ease the viewer in, to tell the younger audiences, don't worry, the Doctor may have a new face, but this is very much the same programme. Why? Daleks, that's why. Yeah, Ben and Polly were still here, but they weren't really in the programme for a long time at this point. So having something which was a constant in the Hartnell era turn up straight away was right. Kids loved Daleks in the 1960s. It's why we had the Dalek mania. We had Dalek lollies, for crying out loud. Having these turn up in Troughton's first story was a stroke of genius. So much so, this was one of the best Dalek stories. Seriously, go and watch it after you're done with this video. It's a great watch. After the futuristic The Power of the Daleks, viewers got The Highlanders, a story responsible for introducing Jamie McCrimmon. This story was very much the end and the beginning of a new structure. The end was the fact that this was the last pure historical for many years. I don't fully know the reason why the idea of having historicals was scrapped for many years. My guess would be probably because audience may have got tired of having these and they were more interested in the futuristic sci-fi elements of the other stories. Well, if this is the case, they got what they wanted. The most typical setting of Troughton stories tended to be a base under siege. The new element which the Highlanders brought to the table was the beginning of a Doctor-companion dynamic between the second Doctor and Jamie, which works so well. You cannot imagine this era without this character. Jamie remained with the second Doctor all the way through to the War Games. In these 3 years, stability was created on screen, at least between Patrick Troughton and Fraser Hines. I often wonder if, in another dimension, we could have ended up with a spin-off about Jamie. It's good to think like that, isn't it? The Troughton era, in my eyes, is a good era. I wouldn't call it perfect, as it still suffers from the problems of the Hartnell era. As such, some stories were too long, and you had the odd stinker in there, like the Dominators. And if you want to talk about structure, I'd say that its first season is a bit all over the place. After all, the regeneration took place at the end of the second story of the season, but no one had ever heard of regeneration, so this could be excused here. One story from season 4 in particular, which suggested to me that it was a little bit all over the place in terms of writing and everything, would be the Underwater Menace. You also had the departures of Ben and Polly in the Faceless Ones. This just happens in one scene and that's that. And this happened quite a lot during the classic series where a companion just suddenly left at the end of a story. It didn't happen all the time, but sometimes you wonder, like, oh, that just felt out of place. Ben and Polly hardly featured in the Faceless Ones. I think this season can be forgiven though because Doctor Who was entering new ground, as I alluded to earlier. It was the first one we ever had a regeneration. The Daleks were being phased out for a time and the Cybermen were becoming the new sort of big bad of the show. By the end of season 4, the show was no longer about being an educational trip through time for youngsters. It was more about how the Doctor could save the day. This is where season 5 blossoms. This season had a perfect structure. Not every story was a masterpiece, but the consistency of good base under siege stories like The Tomb of the Cybermen and Fury from the Deep made Troughton excel as the second Doctor. Indeed, there are oddities in here as well, with stories like The Enemy of the World. This felt like a Bond movie more than a Doctor Who story. But that's fine, because I love Bond, and it was nice to have something different. And again, if there's one story I would check out, it would be that story, because I really do enjoy that, and I think it is an underrated gem from that era. Season 6 was where problems did begin to arise. As mentioned before, The Dominators was awful. It was 5 episodes of dull television. As brilliant as both The Mind Robber and The Invasion were, it may potentially have been one part too long. The problems of the Hartnell era continued to haunt the production, even in the last year of the Troughton era. I feel like there was no consistency behind the scenes. The show was still churning out over 40 episodes per season, which was too excessive, but this is how it was made back then. The cast found it too demanding, and it led to everyone leaving by the end of it. It's hard to believe that Hartnell and Troughton took part in over 100 episodes each, all in the space of 3 years each time. I'm just glad that this time Patrick Troughton did leave on his own terms and not by ill health, which was the unfortunate outcome for William Hartnell. His last story was the perfect summary of the 1960s era of Doctor Who. A story which was too long, but looking past that, what you had here was one of the best swan songs of any Doctor. The War Games encapsulated everything good about the Hartnell and Troughton eras. We had multiple settings, we had these time zones and this intrigue into who the real villains of this piece were. It is no exaggeration that this was the end of an era. The structures which were established since An Unearthly Child were broken once again. This so-called broken structure, though, became ever more familiar with Spearhead from Space, the first story to feature Jon Pertwee and the first in colour. Doctor Who had reinvented itself for Troughton, but a second time was too much to ask for, right? Well, let me tell you, the Pertwee era is one of my favourites. Why? Well, the Doctor was exiled to Earth. No more visiting alien worlds or visiting ancient civilizations. All of that is gone. Instead, what we got was aliens invading Earth. It worked a couple of times before. Why not do it all the time? This worked perfectly for this era in the show's history. Each story in Pertwee's first season featured all new villains. None of them were returning ones. Also, the show was no longer over 40 episodes per season. Thank God. Moving forward, the show would now contain at least 20 episodes from 1970 to 1985. Most of these seasons would feature the same number of episodes and stories, but more on that later. Season 7 featured the grand total of just 4 stories, and they are 4 fantastic stories, all told in the span of 25 episodes. One story was 4 parts long, while the others were 7 parts. I won't beat around the bush. I still think that 7 episodes is a bit too long, but all of these stories are so good, you just forget that. I'm always one for quality over quantity, and here is the proof of why that works. The less stories there are, the more likely you're going to have a good season, unless you're season 24. Remember when I said Troughton's last season was a bit chaotic towards the end? The writers and producers had the task of having to produce 7 stories in 44 episodes. 10 of those episodes were just one story alone. If things were different, we might have had another 1 or 2 stories in there, if things had gone more smoothly behind the scenes. In Jon Pertwee's first season, there's none of that. This season feels more focused on delivering some of the best content that the classic series has to offer. This trend continued with season 8, giving the Doctor an opposite with the introduction of the Master. This season was slightly longer, weighing in at 5 stories told in 25 episodes. While I don't think that it's as good as 7, I enjoy it for what it is. We had 2 4-part stories, 2 6-part stories and 1 5-parter. I think the Demons would have been 6 episodes, but for whatever reason it wasn't. In season 9, the format would be 2 4-parters and 3 6-parters. The episodic format in this season became the formula for the rest of the Pertwee era. For the first time, the programme has a bit of consistency in terms of how much content you're going to get from it. It wasn't going to be like 5 episodes for one story, 8 for the next, and 4 for the one after that, 6 after that, and then boom, a 10-part epic. I think the 4-part and 6-part format works fine for the most part in the Pertwee and Tom Baker eras. Typically, the end of the season featured the 6-part, and usually they were good. I say usually because the Time Monster stands out like a sore thumb in the Pertwee era. Going past that, as the structure now became more focused than ever, the stories began to shift in tone. We started getting off-world stories again after the Doctor's exile ended at the end of the Three Doctors. The budget appeared to be better as the show did not need to produce over 40 episodes a year anymore. 26 episodes was a good number and roughly equates to the length of the first 7 series of the revived era. There were less occasions where I felt bored in the Pertwee era. The pacing of these stories were much better, more so for the 4-parters. I guess it was fitting that this era of the show came to a close on the high, just as it begun with its new format. I'm happy to report that the trend continued into the next. Tom Baker's first season is so synonymous with many Whovians for featuring standout classics like The Ark in Space and a little-known Dalek story called Genesis of the Daleks. It also has Revenge of the Cybermen. This season was the shortest season so far, raking in at only 20 episodes. Once again, there was 5 stories. One of them was a 2-parter though. 3 of them were 4-parters, and one of them was a 6-parter. The most obvious assumption why the format changed this time round was because a new Doctor and a new producer with some ideas being left over from the previous regime. One aspect of this season which always struck me in terms of structure was how experimental it was in terms of storytelling. In this season we had like a sort of loose story arc for the Doctor, Sarah and Harry travelling to the Nerva beacon, to the planet's surface below the beacon, a detour to Skaro to avert the Dalek creation, and a return to Nerva in a different time period. I like how we didn't see our main characters travel in the TARDIS through the majority of the season. We only had them travel in the TARDIS between Robot and the Ark in Space. The TARDIS didn't appear again until the end of the season. That is bold if you ask me, since the TARDIS is the one element which has remained mostly unchanged since the show's beginning. Season 12 took risks. It wasn't afraid to explore new ideas and themes, even with a new face for the show. From here on out, what follows is quite possibly the greatest season of all of Doctor Who. Season 13. From here, the structure was more simple than ever. This structure remained intact, more or less, all the way through the Tom Baker era, because it worked so well. We now had 6 stories, told through 26 episodes, the first 5 being 4 parts, and the finale being 6 parts. It's important to highlight, in particular, that a lot of these stories from season 13 onwards did not share any sort of arc. Each story was very much self-contained. Every few weeks, the show would tell viewers something new, while reusing some elements from the conception of the show. We started getting historical stories again, but this time around they contained further sci-fi elements rather than being just another history lesson for younger audiences. While borrowing themes from other works in popular culture such as Frankenstein, Jekyll and Hyde, or maybe the Hammer horror films, these stories worked so well. By now the 4-parters were the most common standard in Doctor Who. The production no longer had the impending task of writing multiple 6-part stories per season, like the later Pertwee seasons. The structure of the show was so refined, and for me, the Philip Hinchcliffe era got this off to a T, and it is one of the most accessible eras in all of Doctor Who. Most of that is owed to production, amongst a lot of things. It is true that the structure did continue well into the Graham Williams era. However, by this time, I feel that some writers began to struggle utilising the best ideas from script to screen. Stories like Underworld felt like another 6-part slog to get through, but then I realised after watching that this was only 4 parts. If you watch the Tom Baker era from start to finish, you can definitely see a decline in quality, particularly from season 15 onwards. On the other hand, one of the better factors of this era was season 16 because it did bring something new. Season 16 had the clear intention of being a story arc, with the end goal of the season being the Doctor retrieving all 6 pieces of the key to time. Each piece is acquired in each story, and it's quite fun to watch even now. Not all stories are great in this, but the shake-up with the stories in this now interlinking with one another is a great idea for the time and provided a nice change of pace. If anything, season 16 was a breath of fresh air compared to 15. Season-long arcs would become a staple of the modern series many years later. I think it is important to remember that this collection of stories, also known collectively as the Key to Time, is where this idea truly began. It wasn't perfect, but then again, neither was production of the first 6 seasons of Doctor Who. Nevertheless, I still enjoy them for what they are. The familiar format of self-contained stories did return for season 17. Most will know that this season, like the 4 preceded it, would have had 6 stories. However, the last one, Sharda, was never broadcast. If it was, then this would be the last 6-part story ever. On technical grounds, that feat belongs to the Armageddon Factor. So in season 17 we only had 20 episodes instead of 26. All of these episodes were told in 5 4-part stories. I'll be honest, I don't hate season 17. After all, it contains probably the best story from the Williams era, City of Death. However, I think at this point the structure, which was so successful earlier on in the Tom Baker era, was stagnating. The BBC run out of money. In fairness to them though, there were huge issues behind the scenes, which is why we only ended up with 5 stories instead of 6. Now I can't prove this, but I think that when J&T took over for the next season, I like to believe that having 7 stories for season 18 made up for the fact that we lost one in season 17. Season 18 was the season which eradicated the 6-part stories completely. Here we had 7 4-part stories told within 28 episodes. Overall, I like season 18. It felt fresh following on from the tired-looking Graham Williams era. I like how this season also had the subtle overarching themes such as entropy, as well as the East-based trilogy and the return of the Master. All of this made way for the incoming Doctor, Peter Davison, with season 19. The most glaring oddity from season 18 was the change in character of Tom Baker's Doctor. In his final season, he was far more sombre than his previous 6 years in terms of writing and performance. Allegedly, Tom Baker was not a huge fan of what was going on with the show, so he decided to call it quits, later stating that he felt 7 years was too long. One thing which carried through from season 18 to 19 was the illusion that each story followed directly into the next. Structurally, this harkened back to many of the stories from the Hartnell and Troughton eras, and I really liked that touch. It gave the sense of a never-ending story. For Davison's 3 seasons, we were treated to 6 or 7 stories each. All of them were typically 4 parts long, with the other being a sole 2-part adventure. Watching these back, structurally, these stories act the same as any other, typically having your cliffhanger endings before having a resolution. Regardless of the qualities of all of these stories, what I think pulled the audiences in during the Peter Davison era was a new twice-weekly format. Doctor Who was always broadcast on Saturday evenings, but when Davison started, J&T changed that, and what we had was a season lasting shorter but with the same episodes. I think I would have loved it back then when it was on twice. It sounded cool. On the other hand though, I will always believe that Doctor Who was always best suited to the Saturday evenings, as it was more of the grand occasion. I always remember gearing up every Saturday waiting for Doctor Who. It must have felt like that back then, and I felt like that for the early seasons of the revived era, but in recent years when they changed the time slot to Sundays, I don't know, it doesn't feel the same when it's on the Sunday. In Davison's final season, when Resurrection of the Daleks aired, it was aired in 2 parts. Instead of having 4 half-hour instalments, there were 2 45-minute ones instead. Why, you ask? The 1984 Winter Olympics forced a schedule change. Interestingly though, this idea became regular for the next season, which was Colin Baker's first. All of season 22's episodes were 45 minutes each. The programme was restored to the Saturday night tea time slot, and 13 episodes were aired. The structure of how these stories were told ever since 1963 saw the biggest change yet, due to the runtime. Writers had more time to establish the guest characters of each story, and to do more world building. Stories like Revelation of the Daleks, which feature a huge cast, tackled more darker themes of which may have been tackled less if the episodes were just 25 minutes long. Writers no longer had the obligation of having to write a story for the Doctor and his friends and to make way every 25 minutes for them to find themselves in a dire situation just for the sake of a cliffhanger. I think the format worked okay for the most part in season 22. I think there were clear pacing issues though, and it caused a few tonal issues as well. Sometimes the world building of guest characters may have backfired. While Revelation of the Daleks has so many ideas to play with, the Doctor is poorly utilised here. He and Perry almost took the entire first part to do anything. Occasions like this are why this era of the programme was lambasted, and it's such a shame. Moreover, Colin Baker was screwed over even further due to the hiatus between season 22 and 23. There were grand plans for this season, which I think sounded amazing on paper, and sometimes I do wish we did have this season instead of what we were given. What we were given was the trial of a Time Lord season. Here, we were back to 25-minute episodes again. The episode count was greatly reduced to just 14 now. This season holds the reputation for being just one story, making this the longest story in the entire history of the show. You thought that the War Games and the Dalek Master Plan were long? Well, this is certainly too long. I can see what the writers and JNT were trying to do here. They tried something different which had never been done before. If you ask me, I lost interest around the halfway point. Colin Baker gave it his all in this, and it still angers me that he did not get more seasons after this because he was fired. Doctor Who was in turmoil. It was beyond repair at this point, and it was nothing to do with the fact that Colin Baker played the Doctor in such a bad era of writing and structure. One of the most frustrating aspects for me with this era is the fact that I felt there were too many changes being made behind the scenes at once, whether it was to do with the narrative of the show or the structure of the programme. So much so that it doesn't know what it wants to be. Season 23 did not know what it wanted to be. I know I've gone on and on about how the 1960s era didn't always get everything right, but back then it was a brand new show, so you have that excuse. The show did eventually hit its stride in the 1970s, as seasons were no longer oversaturated with too many episodes. Here though, I think this one story betrays some of the strong points of Doctor Who, and that was the whole idea of having an adventure. Sure, we do have sort of 4 adventures in this, but it's just all over the place. Too much time was spent in that damn courtroom, and we kept on shifting between locations. It's no wonder that Chris Chibnall did not know what was going on anymore. Irony. Changing the time of when the programme was on was also one of the final nails in the coffin, because viewers may have lost track of when the show was on. I asked my parents if they remember any of this, and they said that the last thing that they remembered from the classic era was the Peter Davison era. The show was just dying a slow death. One of the biggest reasons why was because it no longer had a structure, let alone poor production and poor scripts. Once Sylvester McCoy was in the role, as I said, it was too late. Season 24 did have 4 self-contained stories. The problem was 2 of them were 4-parters, and 2 of them were only 3 episodes long. We were still reduced to just 14 episodes per season, and this remained until the end of the classic run. All of the stories in season 24 were pretty poor in the grand scheme of things, and the BBC didn't care anymore. The programme was moved to Monday nights. The ratings were a disaster. Seasons 25 and 26 were a marked improvement, with the characterisation of the Seventh Doctor being more cunning. Alas, this did not improve the ratings in any way. While the length of the last 2 classic seasons were identical, the show admittedly was starting to find its feet again by having a structure and really clever story arc surrounding Ace's origins, as well as making the Doctor more mysterious. The biggest regret was we didn't get more content from the McCoy era, or indeed the Con Baker era. Whether it was from longer seasons or a season 27. I think it was all too late, as Doctor Who had the unfair reputation of being past its sell-by date at this point. I always had the belief that Doctor Who might not necessarily work as a film, but what do I know? The 1996 attempt to bring the show back suffered structurally because it had too many tasks to accomplish. Having a regeneration at the beginning would have alienated a lot of newcomers. Some would not have had a clue of what was going on. I am in no means hating on the TV movie because I love McCoy and McGann as a Doctor. I just think if you break it down structurally, it does not work. So, are you still watching? If so, thank you. Also, if you want to hit the subscribe button, then please do so. It would really mean a lot to me. What I did just there was bring something up which I did earlier in the video. Anyway, let's move on. The structure was completely changed when Russell T Davies brought back Doctor Who for the 21st century. Story arcs became more prevalent, maybe too much prevalent in the Moffat era. Don't worry, we'll get there. The 45-minute episode structure returned, and it was more refined than what it ever was in season 22. Many of the stories were self-contained in just one episode now, instead of being spread into multiple parts. We did get multi-part stories in the new series, but it was often just 2 parts and you had the odd 3-parter in there. This is something which was a common occurrence with a lot of other TV dramas that were coming during the 90s and early 2000s, so I think that the revived era of Doctor Who took inspiration. What I really like about the Russell T Davies era is that the storylines felt polished, not perfect, but good enough to make you think. Wow, a lot of planning really went into how the individual stories were written and how the story arcs had satisfying payoffs and how worthwhile it was to sit down and experience a 2-part story in the same vein as it was to watch a lot of 4-parters from the classic era. This truly was the second coming of Doctor Who. The structure of the Christopher Eccleston and David Tennant eras was so well rounded it reminded me a lot of the early Tom Baker era. You typically had 9 or 10 stories per series, all told within 13 episodes. The case would have been that we had 7 standalone episodes and 3 stories which were 2-parters. We even had Christmas specials wedged in between series for good measure. I think in the modern series of Doctor Who, this works perfectly, and I think it still would work even now. Even after the end of the David Tennant era, when Stephen Moffat took the reins as showrunner, the structure of the series initially stay the same. Matt Smith's first series of the Doctor structurally felt like it could have been part of the RTD era. Yes, the tone was completely different, but the format was still the same. However, in his second series, everything changed. In my view, this derailed the structure of the series until this very day. That sounds dramatic because I don't even think that Doctor Who is even close to the dark age that it was towards the end of the 1980s. Some will disagree. A lot of stories in the later years of the Moffat era really do stand out. The problem is they hardly have any time to develop. What became a problem in Matt Smith's second and third series was the change of pace. Series 6 starts off pretty good with a two-parter. A few episodes later we had another two-parter which was underwhelming, but that doesn't really matter. After this we had no more two-parters for 3 years. All of Matt Smith's final series had standalone episodes. So by that what I mean was every episode was a story. It has always been hit and miss because we were deprived of having multi-part stories. Instead what we got were often jumble story arcs which sometimes went nowhere. It is a real shame because I think Moffat is a great writer. He's proven that he can write great television. His problem was he sets everything up so well, but then there's no payoff. Again, some will disagree. In my view, RTD was much better at giving us these grand story arcs. Remember Bad Wolf? Remember Torchwood? Remember Harold Saxon? Remember the Medusa Cascade? All really good arcs in my eyes. What did the Moffat era give us? Well, remember the Pandorica? Overall, pretty fun, but personally I thought the ending was weak. Remember the storyline involving the death of the Doctor? Again, it was fun, but it had a cop-out ending. There was this impossible girl stuff. Who's Missy? Who's the 12th Doctor really? Is he a good man? Who's in the vault? And the worst of the lot, the hybrid. Thematically, we know what the hybrid was. It was the 12th Doctor and Clara. But how this was built up to be a deadly creature beforehand just baffled me. Kind of shows how messy Series 9 really was, and I used to really like that series. The messy structure in terms of the episodes format and the storylines went a bit flip-flop during the Peter Capaldi years too. We had 12 episodes per series now, which became the standard for that era. His first series was largely hit and miss. The series finally had a two-parter at the very end of it, and for what it is, it feels like a grand adventure about love, loss, betrayal, sacrifice, and Cybermen learning how to fly. It was a shame that I really did not like this story one bit. Even when it first came out, I didn't really like that story. After that, Series 9 came along, and structurally, this one did not know what it wanted to be. At first glance, it seemed like every story was going to be multi-parts again, just like the classic series. Then we got duds like The Girl Who Died and The Woman Who Lived. Two of the most forgettable episodes in the Capaldi era. When this first came out, I remember being confused as to whether this was one story or two stories which were interlinked. Kinda like Frontier in Space and Planet of the Daleks was. It turns out they were two different stories. Then we got the Zygon two-parter, two standalone episodes, and again, something I thought was a two-part finale, but it was just another 2 episodes which were 2 separate stories. I refuse to even believe that Heaven Sent and Hellbent are the same story because they are completely different to each other. To my knowledge, it was later confirmed that they were indeed 2 different stories, which I'm really glad about. What hacked me off about these final 2 stories is the fact that one is such a great piece of TV and the other is just there to wrap up a convoluted series, and it doesn't really go anywhere in the end. Series 10 went for the same approach as Series 8. To be honest, I think Series 9 should have gone for this too. That way the Capaldi era would have had more consistent structure throughout. 10 standalone stories before the big two-part finale. However, World Enough in Time and The Doctor Falls suffered the same problem as most other Moffat two-parters. The structure of the story tried to be clever, but it tries too much in the second half and you just become annoyed with it in the end. 1 minute it's a creepy horror story about people being converted into Cybermen. The next it's just a runabout in a farm. You couldn't get a more different tone if you tried it. I may sound harsh because that story does have its standout moments, but if I pick apart its structure, it is a mess. It was a shame because Series 10 was a decent series overall in terms of structure. We had that last Christmas special, let's just forget that ever happened. Now we are in the present, Chris Chibnall, Jodie Whittaker era. To be honest guys, I can't give a full proper assessment on this until either Chibnall or Whittaker leave their respective roles as showrunner and the 13th Doctor. What I will say is that Series 11 is consistent. It doesn't rely heavily on a story arc. All 10 stories had their own identity, much like many stories from the classic series did. On the flip side, it suffers just as much as Series 7, 8 and 10 because of a lack of two-parters. Now I know I just criticised the Series 10 finale, but honestly I was glad that that story did get told over 2 episodes, even if it didn't hit the right notes for me. I'm sure that others will think the opposite, and that's fine, because I must reiterate that this video is just opinion, not fact. I have no idea how people respond to this. What irks me is that the structure of Series 12 is totally different. It just flips everything which was done in Series 11 on its head again. We have this series starting and ending with two-parters, and we had 6 episodes sandwiched in the middle. We also have the return of multiple story arcs. Honestly, sometimes I feel like Series 12 is like the Moffat era all over again. Other times, I do like it for what it is, even though it is quite flawed. Overall though, I cannot give you a concrete answer because in a few years time my opinion on how this structure could totally change. Right now, I think it's iffy. The way the characters are written is sometimes sloppy. Sometimes it's good. One week you would have a really good episode, then the next you could have a really poor one. It is flip-flop like the Moffat era. From what we know with Series 13, we will have 8 episodes. Whether that will be 8 standalone stories is anyone's guess at this point. We will find out later this year. On the whole, I just want to emphasise that with a franchise as massive as Doctor Who, you're never always going to get the structure right. You could tell a story which completely changes from one scene to the next, or you can change the format of the show so many times. Sometimes to its credit, other times to its detriment. There is no right or wrong answer for what sort of structure you like in Doctor Who. I personally love the serialised format which the classic series took on, particularly in the 1970s when the episodes were cut down vastly to accommodate for the writers and actors. I also love the style in which the first 5 series of the new series were presented. I think a lot of that came down to consistency. I always knew what I was going to get. When you change something over and over again in a short time span, that's when I start to lose focus. And sometimes I end up enjoying the content less than I probably should. That sounds really weird, but that's just my own stance on things. It's not the right answer, nor the wrong answer. My view is not fact, it's opinion. My question to you now though, is what's your opinion? Leave a comment, like this video, share this video, be sure to subscribe, and I shall catch you in the next video. Take care guys, bye for now.